Dave Talks Comics, episode 133. Dave Talks Comics in 2016, part 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. This is episode 133. I will be talking about comic books I read in April, May, and June of 2016. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. The first story that I'm going to talk about is Wolverine, Enemy of the State. I had never read this before. This is found in Wolverine issues 20 to 25, which came out between December 2004 and April 2005. It was written by Mark Millar, and the art was by John Romita Jr. and Klaus Janson. And as I was saying, I'd never read this before. I thought the art was beautiful. There was a time when I wasn't crazy about John Romita Jr.'s art. I think certainly Klaus Janson adds something to his art, just like Janson also added something to Frank Miller's art when he was drawing Daredevil back in the early 80s. I think it's a beautifully drawn story. I think it starts off strong, or at least let's put it this way. I think the premise for the story is strong, but I think they tried to bring too much in the end. And I had trouble liking it as much. I mean, it was just kind of ridiculous is what it got to. And, I mean, there was some beautiful fight choreography. There was some very good visual storytelling. I mean, basically what happens is Wolverine gets brainwashed by, I believe it's the Hand, or is it Hydra? One of the two. I think they're working together in this. But he gets brainwashed, and so then he starts working for the bad guys, and he basically is an unstoppable killing machine. There's a bad guy in this named Gorgon who I think is supposed to be a mutant and can turn people to stone by looking at them. He wears sunglasses. When he takes off the sunglasses, and it looks like beams are shooting out of his eyes, but I think that's just an effect they put on the page. I don't think that's what's actually happening. But he can turn people to stone in that way. I don't recall if he clashes with Wolverine in this story, but the story continues in another arc called Wolverine, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is the next 6 issues. I have read those, but I read those later in the year, so I won't be talking about those in this episode. So, on the whole, I can't say that I really recommend the story. I guess if you're a Wolverine completist, you might feel the need to read it, or if you really like the artwork of John Romita Jr. and Klaus Janson work. I'm not sure if they work together on anything else. I don't know. And Mark Millar, I really haven't read a whole lot that he's written. I like the idea behind the story, and I thought it started strong with some good set pieces, but in the end it just was kind of disappointing. It had its moments, I think is probably the best way to put it. The whole is less than the sum of its parts, maybe, I'm not sure, because not every moment was a great moment. So aside from Wolverine, I also read another book, and this was something also that I was reading for the first time, not just this particular book, but this particular character, and that's Hellblazer. And I was reading from a collection called Red Sepulchre. And the first story in that is called High on Life. And this collection, all of it was written by Mike Carey. This particular issue, or this particular story, which was a 2-parter, found originally in Hellblazer 175 and 176 from September and October of 2002, were drawn by Steve Dillon and Jimmy Palmiotti. And I knew a little bit about John Constantine before this. I saw the movie Constantine, although that really didn't tell me a lot about the character. But basically this story is about John Constantine going back to visit his sister and then ending up getting involved in investigating a local crime, which turns out to have a supernatural angle. It just sounds like it's violent crime, but then it turns out to be something much more than that. And I think this was the first time it wasn't the first time that I'd read something drawn by Steve Dillon. It was the second time. The other thing that I'd read that Steve Dillon had drawn before this was some of the Punisher Max that he did with Jason Aaron. And I like his art. There's something about it. That's just kind of weird and looks kind of strange about the way he styles things. But the fact that he has a style, I really like. But there's also something about it that works that I'm just not sure what it is. I mean, maybe it's just the facial expressions to a degree. I'm not sure what to associate him with. Sometimes I can say, well, this artist looks like this other artist, and I'm not too sure who he looks like. Maybe if I think about it some more, it'll come to me. But it was a good story. It was the first 2 of 6 issues that were found in this collection. And I will come back in a moment and talk a little bit more about the other 4 issues, which were a completely separate story. About the time that I was reading Hellblazer, I was also reading All-Star Squadron. I went back and read a couple issues that I read when they first came out, which were issues 5 and 6. These were written by Roy Thomas. The pencils in the first issue were by Rich Buckler, and the second issue was Adrian Gonzalez. Both issues were inked by Jerry Ordway. These issues were cover dated January and February of 1982. And this was the story where the All-Stars went down to Mexico. It starts in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then eventually, I think in the second issue, the story moves to Mexico City, which actually is not very close to the Yucatan Peninsula, but they make it seem as if it is. There's a number of characters who had previously appeared in All-Star Squadron who are also in this issue: Johnny Quick, Liberty Bell, Robot Man. Now I'm having trouble reading my notes. Shining Knight, The Atom, Dr. Midnight, plus Hawkman and Hawkgirl. And the story was that Hawkman and Hawkgirl, and I think also Dr. Midnight and The Atom, all went down to Mexico. And this was like December of 1941. And of course, Hawkman at this time was an archaeologist, so I think this may have had something to do with an archaeological type expedition. Although I don't think they're completely clear on that. I think his fiancée, Hawkgirl, Shaira, not Shaira, it's Shira Saunders. On Earth 2, it was Shira Saunders, I believe, was down in Mexico, and they were going down there to meet her. And then, of course, it turns out there's Nazis down there, and so they wind up fighting Nazis. This story also featured the first appearance of Firebrand, who became a regular in All-Star Squadron. She was the sister of the original Firebrand. Her name was Danette Riley. The original Firebrand was Rod Riley, who was a character that had appeared in Quality Comics. I believe I think he showed up in the Freedom Fighters series that ran in like the late 70s. I don't think I have any of the issues that he showed up in. I have like the first 8 or 9 issues of that series, but so we get the introduction of Firebrand. She finds this costume that her brother had, and all of a sudden she discovers she has flame powers, which they theorize came from her from an earlier story in All-Star Squadron where Wotan had used some magic on her, and it had something to do with that. Must have given her or maybe awakened something in her. Maybe she's a mutant. I know there's no mutants in the DC Comics, but awakened something in her. But anyway, this story, I enjoyed the opportunity to reread it. I think I enjoyed the first part more than I did the second. There was a couple of disconnects in here that didn't quite do it for me. I had fond memories of the story, and it didn't quite live up to my memories of it, and that was a shame. The other Hellblazer story that was found in the collection called Red Sepulchre is the story called Red Sepulchre, which appeared originally in Hellblazers 177 to 180. Those came out December 2002 through March 2003. This story was written by Mike Carey with art by Marcelo Frusin, Frusin. I'm not familiar with him. I like the look of the book. Anyway, in this story, Constantine goes to London to find Gemma, his sister's daughter. He had visited his sister in the previous story in High on Life. And so now his sister had told him that her niece had gone missing. She'd gone to London, so he's in London looking for her. He finds her, but she's hanging out with some very bad people. And he gets caught up in a brouhaha over an artifact known as the Red Sepulchre. Most of the players in this are people from his past, or at least it's not clear to me because I haven't read a lot whether these people have actually appeared before or if he's just making references to them. They may not have appeared in comic books before, but he certainly makes references to them as though he's familiar with them, as though he's had dealings with them before. And so most of these are people from his past. And the story on the whole has a very noir feel to it, and it definitely makes me want to read more. There were some nice twists in the story. I like the whole mix of the noir with the supernatural. It can be done right, it can be done wrong, and I think that Mike Carey, and he wrote, the impression I get is there's at least a few trades of him writing Hellblazer. And his Hellblazer is not one that I'd heard necessarily recommend. Not that it wasn't recommended, not that people said it was bad, but there was other ones that I'd heard that were recommended. But I really enjoyed this. I picked up this collection at, I want to say, either Baltimore or Heroes Con sometime in the last few years. And I'm really glad I did. I'm really glad I read it. The artwork in both stories I felt was strong, and the stories I felt were strong. It's probably not everybody's cup of tea, but it certainly did the trick for me. Next, I went back to a story which I would say is not easy to summarize. It's the story from, well, it came out when I was very, very young, before I was even able to read, and that's Avengers Kree-Skrull War. I had never read this story in its entirety before. I think I might have read one or two of the issues prior to this. It ran from, if you have the deluxe collection, I read this on Marvel Unlimited, but if you have the deluxe collection, it includes issues 89 to 97 of Avengers. And those issues came out from June of 71 to March of 1972. There's a number of art teams on this book. I believe the original artist on this was Sal Buscema. Then later you get Neil Adams and Tom Palmer, and then you also get John Buscema, I believe, and Tom Palmer drawing it later on. So it's 9 issues altogether, and it's kind of all over the place a bit. It does a lot of different. It goes into a number of different places. Basically, it begins with Captain Marvel coming to Earth. It's not his first time. It's not his first appearance, but he's followed by the Kree, who at first want to take over the Earth. And I'm going over this very briefly. This is a very long and involved story. But the Kree leave eventually, after a couple issues, because a war has started with the Skrulls. Then you get the Inhumans coming into the story. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver get captured by the Super Skrull. The Avengers chase them into outer space to rescue the 2 mutants who were their teammates also. There's a lot of things going on in this. It was okay at times. There was times where I really liked it. I mean, Neil Adams' artwork is beautiful. Even Sal Buscema's artwork is very nice. There's some moments in there that are beautiful to look at, and there's some great storytelling in this. There's some of the love story between the Vision and the Scarlet Witch that I really liked. It's very creative what they do with this story. On the whole, I don't think it works for me. It's a decent story, especially the ending. The ending is kind of like the story got to the point where, okay, we've gone too far with this. We have to rein this in. We have to end it somewhere. And so they kind of just wrapped it up fairly quickly with a device that I really didn't like. When I say a device, I mean a storytelling device that I really didn't like. It was just too simple, and maybe it's that I don't know what follows it, but I wasn't that crazy about it. I'm glad that I've read it now. I can say that I've read it. I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend it unless you're somebody who wants to read some of the great, stories that are considered to be great or stories that are considered to be classic. Now, if I had read this in its entirety when I was younger, I might have had a different appreciation of it back then. I'm sure I would have had a different appreciation of it back then. But today, I have a hard time saying this is something that most people should read. Now I want to go back to a collection that I talked about on the last episode, but not in very much detail, and that's the Cloak and Dagger Crime and Punishment. All I could think of was War and Peace, and I knew it wasn't that. Cloak and Dagger, Crime and Punishment. This is the collection that collects all of the early appearances of Cloak and Dagger, and actually now, since the last time I recorded, I've discovered that there's some new collections out that not only collect this, but some of their appearances that immediately follow these, or their subsequent appearances that not necessarily the immediate. I think you know what I mean. So the first story in this, not the first, the second story in that collection is called The Return. Well, it doesn't really have an overarching title. It's a 2-issue story. It ran in issues 69 and 70 of Spectacular Spider-Man because at this time they did not have their own book. They would later. They would have a miniseries, but at this time they did not. So this is basically the return of Cloak and Dagger. And these issues came out in August and September of 1982. So Cloak and Dagger are back, and they're hunting Silvermane because this pair are vigilantes. Silvermane is a mob boss, and I talked about him a little bit on the last episode when I was talking about the New Goblin storyline from Amazing Spider-Man issues, I think it was 175 to 180. But Silvermane was in that story. I mean, it was kind of a Peter or a Spider-Man Green Goblin story, but Silvermane also played a role in that. And then there was this 3-way battle in the last issue between the 3 characters, in which Silvermane fell from a great height in Radio City Music Hall and was badly injured, and that's where he is at the beginning of this story. But Cloak and Dagger have decided he needs to die because he's the one behind a lot of the drugs that kids are taking on the streets at this time in the early 1980s. Spider-Man tries to stop them, but they manage to kill him. But no, they don't, because Silvermane obviously had some sort of a backup plan, and his doctor transfers his brain into a cybernetic body, or it does something, so he comes back in this body. It looks a little bit like the Terminator or the T-1000 or maybe the Terminator after it's, all the flesh was burned off of it, the original T-100? Is that what the original one was? So it's a pretty neat story, I mean, you get more, and Silvermane's going to be back before the end of this, but before the end of this collection. Oh, and this story was written by Bill Mantlo and drawn by Ed Hannigan and Al Milgrom. The next story I read is called It Rhymes with Lost. Now, this goes back to the 1950s. In fact, back to 1950 exactly. It was written by Arnold Drake and Matt Waller with art by Matt Baker. Arnold Drake was also one of the creators of the Doom Patrol, the original Doom Patrol. So this was published in 1950, and the main character is named Hal, and he is a reporter who's caught between 2 women, Rust and Audrey. Rust is, I'm guessing, about his age, and is a woman who he had a relationship with 10 years prior to this story. So I'm guessing that the 2 of them are probably in their mid-30s, and the other woman, Audrey, is much younger. She's probably around 20, and Rust is now married to Audrey's father. So she's her stepmother. And Rust is kind of running things in this town. And at first, Hal doesn't want to believe it, so it's kind of the story of how he comes to know about what's actually going on in this town and then deciding to report on it. And he kind of gets pulled back and forth between the two women. At first, he wants to be with Russ, then he wants to be with Audrey, then Russ starts, turning on the charm, and he goes back to her. But eventually, he sees he sees that things aren't quite as Russ keeps trying to portray them to be, and he does the right thing. But it's an interesting story. It's a good story, and it's the kind of story I like. It's a little dated. It's dated. It's probably not for everybody. The artwork is very nice, but it's an interesting story because it's basically kind of a graphic novel at a time when there really weren't graphic novels. I'm not sure if it was originally released in the format that it appears now. You can get it. It's not that expensive. You can find. I don't know if it's in print, but I think you can find used copies. Dark Horse reprinted it several years ago, and I think you can still find it out there. So going back to Cloak and Dagger, the next story that they appeared in was Spectacular Spider-Man 81 and 82 from August and September of 1983. This was written by Bill Mantlo once again, with art by Al Milgrom and Jim Mooney. Now this story also involves the Punisher, and it opens with the Punisher escaping from prison. Spider-Man ends up battling Cloak and Dagger again. He seems to think that there's this, and I think this began in the previous story. There seems to be this attraction between he and Dagger, and he seems to think that Cloak has some sort of a hold on Dagger. It's not clear exactly why he thinks this. Maybe a certain amount of racism on his part. I don't know. Because Cloak is black and Dagger is white and he's white, and so he thinks that Dagger is, or Cloak is evil. But Dagger denies this, and anyhow, the Punisher attacks Kingpin. Spidey ends up battling Cloak and Dagger a second time, defending the Kingpin. After trying to warn him, and the Kingpin kind of brushes it off like, "Bah, I don't care about that," And this story, actually, this is not it. You get two parts here. There's actually a third part to the story, but Cloak and Dagger aren't in it, and so that's the end of this story in this collection. And and one thing that is interesting about the story is that it's the first time that it shows Cloak feeding off of the light that Dagger provides. And that's something that I believe comes up quite... So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between Cloak and Dagger that they're starting to portray here, which becomes part of their story going forward. Okay, hopefully I'm starting to wind down, but I still have a few more things to talk about. The next one is the Fade Out. I'm only going to talk about the first 4 issues now because I kind of took breaks as I was reading it. The Fade Out was written by Ed Brubaker, the art's by Sean Phillips, and the colors are by Elizabeth Breitweiser. The first 4 issues, when it was collected in trade, it's 12 issues in all. They were collected 4 issues per trade. I bought this on Comixology. If you buy the individual issues on Comixology, you actually get all the extras that were available in the print edition. I believe if you just get the trade edition on Comixology, you don't get the extras. So, and I bought it when they had a sale where it was like $1 an issue. I think the last issue had just come out, and so I had to pay $2 for that one or something like that. But the main character is named Charlie Hirsch. He's a screenwriter for Victory Street Pictures, and he wakes up after a night of partying and discovers the body of Valeria Summers, the star, the female lead of the movie he's been working on. She was strangled to death, and Charlie can't remember anything, or can't remember much of the night before. So the story unfolds from there, moving both forward and backward. backward through flashbacks, of course. And the story takes place in Hollywood. It's in the late 1940s, at a time when many people were blacklisted or banned from working in the film industry due to their past associations, sometimes real, sometimes imaginary, with the Communist Party. And by the end of this section of the story, the mystery of who killed Val Summers is not revealed. So that's kind of the overarching story behind it. I don't know if there's really an arc in these 4 issues. I mean, it basically sets things up. There are some new characters who were not on the scene who are introduced. Of course, everything is new to the reader, but there are people who are introduced that Charlie did not know before. And I really like the way this story unfolds. I like these kinds of stories, and I thought these 4 issues were very compelling. I bought the entire series in one chunk because I have previous experience with Ed Brubaker. I like the way he writes. I like the kinds of stories he tells, both superhero and non-superhero, although I've read a lot more of his non-superhero stuff than his superhero stuff. And I was not disappointed with this. If you like those kinds of stories, I would definitely recommend this. Even if you don't, you might want to give this a try. This is definitely a superior effort and one of my favorites from this period of time as far as what I was reading. The last story from the Cloak and Dagger collection that I want to talk about in any detail was from issues 94, 95, and 96 of Spectacular Spider-Man, which came out September, October, November of 1984. Now, these stories were not, this is the only story that was not written by Bill Mantlo. This one was written by Al Milgrom, and the art was by Jim Mooney. Or maybe Al Milgrom penciled it also. I'm not sure. But this is a fairly intricate story. Basically, it opens with the Kingpin scientist reviving Silvermane, who was more or less killed at the end of the last story by Dagger. But they place this collar on him. They call it a submission collar, which is supposed to force Silvermane to do their bidding. It's not entirely successful. Basically, the Kingpin's wife, Vanessa, is dying, and he wants Dagger to save her, so at one point he's trying to get Silvermane to capture her. There's a lot of stuff going on in this story. There's other characters, some of whom I was familiar with, like Cloak and Dagger, the Kingpin, Silvermane, and some I was not familiar with, like the Rose and the Answer, and even the Black Cat, who I know of, but I really don't know much about. And this is also right about the time of Marvel Superhero Secret Wars. So this is the time that Spider-Man gets his black suit. And so for the first 2 of these 3 issues, he's still wearing the black suit. And it's about this time that he realizes there's something up with the black suit. And in the final issue, actually changes back to his old costume, the red and blue costume. And there's some intimation, some in something or other, that something's going on with the suit. But that's not really the focus of this story. The focus of this story is this whole battle between these various parties. The Answer is a guy who's working with the Kingpin. The Rose is kind of a mercenary who does jobs for the Kingpin. And it's, so you end up with this big all-out battle. Honestly, as with all of these stories, if you want to know more about them, in some cases I took very detailed notes, and you can find all that at my notes blog, and I will include direct links to these stories in the show notes for this podcast. So and then there's 2 more stories, and I'm not going to talk about them, really just mention them here in this collection, and they are from Marvel Team Up Annual 6, where Cloak and Dagger teamed up with Spider-Man and the New Mutants. I wasn't that crazy about it, but I did take notes about it. And then there's another one from Marvel Fanfare number 19, and this was a 3-part story, all of which was written by Bill Mantlo, but each part was illustrated by a different artistic team. So it kind of, and they're not similar styles either. So it's really a weird sort of, I'm not crazy about stories like that, where you have different teams telling different parts of the story. Unless, I mean, maybe if you have 2 different teams and they're telling completely different, but if the setting is supposed to be more or less the same, New York City, and you're just different parts of the same story, quite often it doesn't work for me if you do that. And so that kind of rounds out the the Cloak and Dagger Crime and Punishment collection. And then the final comic book that I wanted to talk about is Superman Adventures number 21. I tried to record a podcast about this on a couple occasions. This is called Last Daughter of Argo. This is from July of 1998. This is from Superman Adventures, so this is from the DC Animated Universe perspective. It was written by Evan Dorkin and Sarah Dyer, and the art is by Brett Blevins and Terry Austin. It's an okay story. I don't love it. It's a double-sized story where you get, which introduces Supergirl into the DC Animated Universe comic books. You get her origin story. In fact, the first 15 pages or so are all origin story. And then you also get a battle between her and General Zod, who was in the Phantom Zone, but you get some interference by Kanto of Apocalypse, who releases Zod from the Phantom Zone under orders from Granny Goodness. And it's also worth mentioning that the Supergirl of the DC Animated Universe, there's some differences in her origin between that and the Supergirl of the comic books, the pre-crisis, even the post-crisis comic books. Argo isn't a city, but it's a planet, and I mean, you'd really have to get into I don't feel like getting into all the details of it, but it's an interesting. But it's a good story. It's a decent story. For some reason, I could not get very excited enough to do a whole podcast about it. I thought there was enough material there, especially with it being a double-sized issue, but it didn't exactly work out for me. So that's it for episode 133. Dave Talks Comics can be found at davetalkscomics.com, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other locations. You can find my notes blog at davetalkscomicsnotes.blogspot.com. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter at davetalkscomics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.